us an overview of oak woodlands in California. So, Greg, I'll turn it over to you for about 40 minutes.
Thank you, Greg. Is this a good time to ask the question, the other poll question of where people are geographically located?
Yeah, I can drag that on over there. Why
don't you do that? And that way, because we talk about different kinds of oak woodland types, I think it'd be nice for the audience. There we go. It'd be nice for the audience to have a chance to just go ahead and click like you did last time, guys, and just so we get a feeling for who's tuning in here. I have to admit, for all of you out in Etherland, this is a new experience for me. In some ways, I feel like Miss Nancy on Romper Room. I'm looking out. I can see Roger with his feet up on the coffee table and Yana having a blueberry muffin and orange juice. So I see people signed in. A lot of you I know. Thank you for giving us some of your time today. The other thing that this experience is allowing me to do, I'm sitting at my desk and I've got 4 reference books open before me. So those of you who know me real well know that it's like an open book test for me here today. I'm not as smart as I'm going to sound because I've got all this material laid out that I'll be able to draw on over the next few minutes. So once the poll is where we have...
I'll move that over there, Greg. And
that's fine. So we've got the Sierra and the North Coast are well represented. A lot of folks from the Central Coast. Southern California, welcome. Richard, I hope that's one of you down in Ojai. And good. Perhaps even some folks from out of state. So welcome. And as soon as this moves out of the way, I'll go ahead and start my presentation. Again, over on the left side too, the Q&A chat, please feel free to go ahead and raise your hand and ask a question when you'd like. Those of you that have heard me talk before know that I'm making this up as I go along and there's no train of thought that you're going to disturb. So feel free to ask questions as we move through this series of slides here. Most of the time it's amazing to me over the years when we talk about oak, people focus on the tree. And even though the tree is important, if you flip through the guidelines that hopefully you've got laid out in front of you this morning as you're listening to us, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to think about the collection of trees that we call a plant community, or we refer to as a forest type or a chaparral type or whatever moniker we want to hand on the plant community. But oak trees, like conifers and everything else, are made up of a number of different parts that allow that organism, that living organism, to sustain itself over time. The uniqueness of an oak tree and what we find about oak is their ability to live in so many different types of conditions. And because of their variability and their adaptability, we find oak spread out throughout much of California. Don't find them in the desert. We don't find them up, high above snowline. But for the most part, their ability to retain water or even absorb water in the case of some riparian species, this structure that you have before you is so different among the various species of both tree and shrub type of oaks that it has allowed them, since the recession of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago, when we've seen oaks become dominant on the landscape. So what I'd like to do today in my first series of discussions here with you is, let's forget about the tree. Let's think about recognizing that the tree is an integral part of a larger plant community, but I want to talk more holistically on a broader scale, and let's talk about a woodland, or let's even think of it as a forest type, recognizing that, like so many of you know that are listening to us, there are different types of forest types, different structures of forest. So I'm going to use the term broadly, but when I talk about, let's think about a forest, or think about a woodland as a forest type, it could be part of a forest community, it can be part of a chaparral community, and I know a lot of you are working in areas that are often described as savannas. And though there may not be a single definition of what a savanna is, I think we can describe what a savanna is, and people can close their mind and picture these large stately trees spread sparingly across the landscape. And as with all forest types, in many cases, they're made up of a number of plant associates. It's It's not just one kind of tree. Even if there's a dominant species of tree, there are other shrubs and grasses that are part of a larger or broader plant community. And the important thing, particularly when talking about sustainability or the long-term ability of that forest to sustain itself, we are focusing on the importance of different age cohorts. How do we get those seedlings to the sapling stage, and how do those saplings persist long enough in the environment so that they become a young tree that matures? And when I talk about maturity, I'm talking about reproductive maturity, where they can actually flower, set acorns, and set progeny for continuation of the species. Again, many of you know this. This is just to help us all get our heads wrapped around the subject this morning. When we talk about a forest type or a woodland, I think we all recognize that it's a collection of parts that are working together. Some of these parts are seasonal, like you see up on your screen. Even though the first food source that comes to mind are acorns, we all recognize that acorns are a fleeting seasonal food source. Some years they may even be absent. Depending on the species of oak, they may be cyclic. We know from work that's been done at the UC Hastings Preserve down in Monterey County that valley oaks, Quercus lobata, for example, are very cyclic in their ability to produce acorns on a 6 or 7 year cycle. And the rest of the time, there may not be very many acorns hanging off the trees, while others are more dependable. Many of the live oaks are much more dependable on an annual basis of producing acorns. Those of you on the North Coast this year couldn't help but notice the unbelievable berry crop that the madrone trees shared as part of this working forest landscape. Literally, there were areas in these oak woodlands that were bright red for months and months on time, an incredibly important food source for things like robins and bluebirds and a number of berry-eating species. But again, it's a fleeting source. It came into the system. Now the berries are fading out, and there's something else has to pick up and shoulder the responsibility of sustaining organisms out there by providing another food source. And then there's systems within systems. You see the little picture down in the right-hand corner of the riparian zone. Again, riparian areas are highly confined in California. As you know, California is a dry state. Only about 1% of the state is actually covered in water. And in most of those small areas, those small creeks, and even some of the larger rivers are very sensitive to disturbance, simply because they are so constrained in their distribution. But put all of these different parts together, and that's what we have. That's how they work together. A more engineering view of how a plant community or a forest may work is in this graph that I put together, where we have a number of elements, all equal, separate but equal on the bottom row. Various landscape elements, streams and soil and terrain affecting distribution and presence or absence of plant communities. The vegetation types which are dependent on those landscape elements. And again, as many of you know, and when we talk about oak woodlands, they're not contiguous across the landscape. Some communities are patchy. In other types of woodland types, there are different layers where you have dominant canopy trees with subdominant subcanopy trees, and then forbs and herbs on the forest floor. And then within those vegetation types, there are other elements that I refer to as community elements that make the forest work, that provide the nooks and crannies that we'll talk about in much more detail on my second talk. But the live and dead trees, the cliffs, the rock piles, the down logs, both biotic and abiotic components of this living system, working in concert to make this functional forest type. Here's a picture of the Eel River watershed in northern Mendocino County, and what I've done is just put labels to dissect what's in one picture, and just for all of us, because everybody that's listening in today knows this image that I'm putting up in front of you. I mean, you know that if you dissect a forest, you can pull out those different parts. But I wanted to take this opportunity for all of you who are so busy in your lives, running around trying to do so many things, to actually stop and remind us all that, yeah, a forest is a collection of parts working together and perhaps in some cases even a symbiotic relationship, in the soil, how the soil can allow certain species to grow and thrive. So here's an example where in one image, we dissect that image, you can see how many different parts of, some might call this a forest, some might call this an oak woodland, some might call this a convergence of a number of different plant communities. And as you know, that's commonly the case for oak woodlands throughout the state. Zooming in even more, here's just a close-up, a little different type of example with the same kind of dissection, if you will. Here's a blue oak forest or a blue oak woodland. A dominant species of tree covers the landscape, but again, and it's not perhaps as diverse as that last image, but again, there is diversity in this picture. You can see, there's a rock outcropping up in the top. Perhaps that's a perch for peregrine falcons or even turkey vultures, or depending on where you are, a number of rodents may use that. Obviously, a rocky substrate is going to affect the porosity of the soil, how water moves through the soil, and how it can collect in a catchment basin downstream of some kind. I think everybody on here knows that most of the grasses in oak woodlands are not native grasses. The plant community has become dominated by European, today we'd call them invasive species. They've been here so long we just consider them part of the natural landscape, but by any definition, many of them are invasive and very aggressive and have changed the landscape since the introduction of European land use practices. And again, a down log down in the foreground of the picture, adding another layer of structure, another piece of diversity that might be used by a blue-belly lizard or, unfortunately, even a rattlesnake. So we all know we have to be careful when we're out in the woods. Somebody asked the question, what's a Gary oak? I'll get to that in a few minutes. Also known as an Oregon white oak. Since the 1950s, the trend in California has been steady in that these larger ranches that perhaps many of our parents knew, they've been subdivided and they've been parceled to smaller and smaller ranchettes or even housing subdivisions. Very nice work done by Louise Fortman over in Nevada County showed how in the 50s the average forest parcel over there was over 900 acres, and today it's closer to 9 acres. It should come as no surprise that this trend is occurring and will continue to occur. All of us know that the resource pie in California is only so big. Well, there's more and more people that want a piece of that pie. And so what happens is the finite amount of land is being carved up and parceled out to accommodate more and more demands on the landscape. If any of you ever take a ride up into northern Mendocino County, as you come into Covelo, there's a great sign on the Diamond H Ranch that says, "Be kind to the land, they ain't making anymore." And that's so true. It's what we have is all we have, and that's what we've got to work with. And so today, when we're dealing with folks that are interested in managing oak woodlands, we're dealing with a community of people that have a smaller piece of that pie. And I think it's important to try and relate, regardless of the size of the pie, it's important to relate that slice back to the greater whole. That if we're truly going to talk about sustainability of oak woodlands in California, we have to recognize that this particular type of a plant community is part of a larger continuum. As we know, as we move farther east from the Central Valley and moving up into the Sierras, you come out of the valley, you move up into the foothills, and it's dominated by blue oaks and grapevine. You go a little bit farther, and the ponderosa pine takes dominance. You go farther yet, and you get into red fir. So if you run a transect across the state, it's really hard to see where one plant community ends and the other one begins, because they simply transition from one to another with elevation or soil type or other edaphic factors. I know most of you have seen this slide before. This picture shows the distribution of oaks, in quotes, if you will, throughout the state. within that green area, there are any number of species of oaks that could be found growing in association with each other. Generally, we like to suggest that the coast or the oaks are in this bathtub ring around the Central Valley, recognizing that at one time, even the Central Valley would have been included in the description of oak woodlands as valley oaks were a dominant species over much of the area, along with California sycamore and other shrubby species. But generally today, the vast majority of oaks are distributed on a north-south axis along the coast ranges, and you can see quite far down. This is a map of California. Those of you that know the plant communities of Baja and all of Mexico know that they have an incredibly diverse and robust diversity of oaks down even farther south. And then the Sierra Nevadas, again, has an incredibly robust diversity of oaks, again, affected by elevation. Blue oaks in the foothills transition to black oaks farther upslope. It's hard to find them in the desert, and it's hard to find them in extreme elevations. Not to say they won't grow, and I've seen people plant oaks in a home landscape in some pretty bizarre places over the years. And they are resistant, but this is just natural distribution I'm talking about. As you would expect, tree species distribution is affected by the things listed on the left-hand side of the slide here. That one picture of the black oak covered in snow is taken in Yosemite Valley, and the blue oaks down in the lower picture are found in hotter, drier sites. And even as all plant communities, you can have a watershed, and the north-facing slope plant community of hardwoods is going to be different than the south-facing slope. And as we've seen in the pollen paleontology, mud cores that have been taken, at least in Northern California, where I'm familiar with, most of this change occurred towards the end of the Wisconsin ice age, when there was a transition from heavily conifer-dominated sites to more oak pollen showing up in the fossil record and oaks distributing themselves throughout California. Well, there's lots of different kinds, and this is the list that's generally referred to as distinct oak forest types. And most of these are tree form. Many of them, somebody asked a question earlier what the Gary oak, that's Quercus garryana, or the Oregon white oak. I'm going to break these down as we go through our slides. But I do, so to show you relative distribution and some of the characteristics. If you go in your book on the guidelines book, and if you look at table 2.1 on right in the middle there, a lot of what I'm sharing with you is coming right out of those charts that you're finding in your book. So it's on page 11, 12, and 13. So it's kind of a review of what we have here. I think what's interesting and why I've always enjoyed learning more about oaks over the course of my career is that so many of these are endemic and are found only naturally in California. Not every one of these on this list can make that claim, but many of them can. Certainly the blue in the valley and the Engelmann oak. Well, that goes into Mexico. I misspoke, but the coast live oak. Those are all species that are true Californians, and like so many of us, take pride in that. Here's a list, just a commonly accepted list in most plant classifications of the different oaks, both tree form and shrub form, that are found in California. Again, I think it's a testament to their resilience and their tenacity, and that they've been able to secure niches over a very broad landscape and diverse landscape. One that's cold, one that's hot, dry, wet. Some of the native shrubs, oaks on the right-hand side, you'll notice that they are limited to an island or two on the Channel Islands in Southern California. Others like the black oak or the Oregon oak have a much broader distribution. The native shrub oaks, some of you might say, well, I've never heard of a Tucker's oak or a Cedrus islands oak. You can imagine the taxonomists are having a field day with so many little nuances of oak tree morphology that it seems like it's an ever-changing list of names. I wouldn't get too hung up on that. Simply recognize that there are lots of different kinds, and what one is called today versus what one is called next week probably doesn't matter much to the tree itself. But again, I think it's a testament, as I said, to their tenacity and how they've been able to adopt and adapt themselves over time. Oftentimes we talk about large oak groups, and so I wanted to break it down first and talk about the white oak group. Those are the group of oaks that many of us are familiar with. You can see the list there: the blue oak, Engelmann oak, Oregon white, and valley oak. These are these big, stately, deciduous trees. They're all deciduous. One trait they share in common is that all of their acorns mature in 1 year. That being said, so when the weather gets warm in different parts of the state, you'll notice that the catkins will come out on an Engelmann oak or a blue oak here shortly, regardless of where you are this morning. And the catkins will come out, and there'll be pollination, and whatever fruit is set this year will mature and ripen this coming autumn. It's just a strategy that I think is important in a few minutes here when we talk about those trees that take 2 years to ripen their acorn. So, but this whole group is characterized by, just like an apple tree or any other fruit tree that you might be familiar with, these fruits on these trees, these acorns, are pollinated and ripen within one growing season. They share some other characteristics. As I said, they're all deciduous in this group, and many of them have lobed leaves. Some more lobed than others. The valley oak is incredibly lobed, and the garry oak is less lobed. And I think all of you know they hybridize. So you go look at a tree that's been standing there for 150 years, and you're not really sure what its parental lineage is because one tree can have characteristics of two species. It's just what we have to deal with out there in dealing with oak taxonomy and systematics. The other group, the other large group, is the black or red oak group. As you see down the bottom of the list, most of these are the live oaks: coast oak, shreve oak, interior, live oak. The exception to the evergreen oak is the California black, which is deciduous. They all share some similar characteristics in the caps of their acorns. If you look at the picture there of the acorn, look at the caps. They're described as having scale-like caps. They look like shingles on a house laid down on top of each other. All of these species share that characteristic. What's interesting and what's unique about this particular group, this is a group that take 2 years for their acorns to mature. So the flowers that get pollinated this year in 2011 will not bear fruit until fall of 2012. So it's a full year out. Now, one of the advantages, if you let me use that term, in having a mixed group of oak trees that have overlapping fruit drop is that if, let's say, this year it continues to be wet and the white oak group has a poor pollinating season and subsequently has a poor acorn crop, well, perhaps this group on your screen here, the live oaks or even the black oak, whose flowers were pollinated last year when timing may have been better for pollination, they may in fact have a bumper crop this coming year. And so for those organisms that are dependent on that seasonal acorn crop, having a multitude of species out there increases the opportunity of having some acorns on any given year. So I think when we talk about management later on in the series, if you're dealing with oak stands or oak type that have multiple species, it's important to recognize that particularly if you're going to be in any kind of active management and you're going to be removing trees for whatever reason, it would be prudent to try and keep a representative sample from both the white or the red group, simply to ensure that you may have more acorns on the landscape on any given year. But this is generally how the two major groups are separated. And there are some other intermediate groups, again, where their acorns mature in the second year. Canyon live oak and the island oak are two examples of that. They tend to have smooth margin leaves, as I've said here. The canyon oak is widely distributed throughout California, particularly in the north and in the Sierras. But as its name implies, it's like the valley oak is more restricted to deep alluvial soils. The canyon oak is more restrictive, not in every case, but more restrictive to deeper canyons and riparian areas. I think I just answered your question, Pat, about this canyon live oak in this category. So it's in the intermediate. It's considered to be in the intermediate group. You're welcome. Again, this is reviewing what I just said. I got a little ahead of myself, but these mixed group associations, can be important depending on why you're managing your particular parcel. I know a lot of you that are managing conservation lands are interested in perhaps doing some restoration activities. So even in restoration activities, if you know what the site has historically grown or what it's capable of growing, putting in a mix of 1- and 2-year acorn crop trees, if it's appropriate for the site, would be important. For those of you who are landowners and perhaps you're using your land for firewood, if you're actively cutting trees to thin a stand to address fire management or something, that would be a concept that I would ask you to keep in mind. That if you have acorn trees that are maturing in 1 or 2 years, and you want to maintain a deer herd, and if you're feeding wood ducks or whatever, it'd be important to realize that these trees that might be providing that resource at an overlapping years. So many of you know, it's not uncommon to find both tree forms and shrub forms growing together, or at least in close proximity to each other. And that gets back to my earlier slide about how slope and soil type and aspect and all those things affect the plant community establishment. Let's break down a little bit about some of the trees, and here's where it's going to sound like I'm really smart as I move to all of my different references in front of me. But the blue oak is probably the iconic oak tree over much of California. It's one of the endemic species. It's found within that bathtub ring that I showed you earlier. As you go farther south, you transition an ecological similarly ecological tree is found farther south in the Engelmann oak. I think I have a slide coming up. But for the most part, the blue oak is a coast range and Sierra foothill species of oak. It's one of those oaks in the white group. Its acorns mature in 1 year. It's a tough species. It's a fighter. It can be found on extremely dry site. I remember years ago when the oak program for UC started, we took some samplings of some blue oaks from throughout the state. We cut one tree down and counted the rings on a 3-inch diameter tree. The thing was growing out of a rock. A 3-inch tree is about the size of an adult man's wrist. That tree was 97 years old. Felt bad after we did that. I thought, wow, the thing was moving along fine, and here come the biologists along and finding. Roger says he lost the sound. Is everyone else hearing me? Otherwise, I'll just continue to talk and let the other folks work on that. So blue oaks, again, are incredibly tenacious, are found in many dry sites and are one of the more common trees. And you can find them in pure stands, as these images are showing you, and in savanna-like stands, though I haven't often heard about blue oaks being referred to savannas. They are good sprouters, by the way. They will sprout very vigorously after a fire, and even following firewood cutting, I've seen them sprout. The challenge is that the young sprout seem to be extremely palatable to things like deer, and without some protection, as soon as they throw out a sprout, the deer seem to find them, and then eventually the roots get starved, and there's no more buds to push, and they won't sprout. So if you're thinking of sprouting blue oaks and you're doing some cutting, you will need to take some measures to protect the sprouts from herbivory, and I would include grasshoppers with that as well as deer. Valley oak, certainly in certain parts of the state, it is the iconic species. These big, mature, very large trees that, as the name implies, are often found in association with riparian or river or stream systems. The Central Valley being one giant riverine system, if you will, with the Delta and the Sacramento system. Other sensitive plant communities often found associated with valley oak are things like vernal pools, and as I've already mentioned, riparian areas. Again, one of the white oak group, their acorns mature in 1 year, and I don't know why, but I can tell you from experience that they are not a good sprouter after fire or cutting. Their reproductive strategy seems to be based on a single approach, and that's depositing acorns and starting from seedlings. Again, think about where these trees are naturally found growing. They're in some of the best soils of the world, some of the most rich and deep alluvial soils found anywhere in the world. And so it makes sense thinking that, well, if this tree dropped an acorn, it's falling to a very good seed bed, and chances are it's going to take off. So generally speaking, valley oaks are fairly easy to propagate if you put them in the right place. Here's a distribution of Quercus garryana, or the Oregon white oak. If you have two leaves right next to each other with a valley oak, sometimes they're hard to tell apart. If my friends from the Pepperwood Preserve are listening to this, they're all jumping up and down. They know how to tell the two apart, but it does take a trained eye to recognize the difference between garryana and lobata in terms of the shininess of the leaves and the depth of the lobes. But for the most part, and this isn't absolute, but for the most part, as you can see the map here, the Gary oaks, or Oregon white oak, as its name implies, follow the coast ranges to the north. And by the time you get to Sonoma County, that's about the farthest extent of the range. Though if you look in Griffin and Critchfield, they have a more extensive range for this species, and you can find a few scattered down through the southern Sierra, but the bulk of the trees are found to the north. Again, a member of the white group. And I think this is the last white group example I've got. The Engelmann oak, you can see on the map, they're an incredibly limited distribution in California, though it does go down into Mexico. It's ecologically, it's very similar to the blue oak up in Northern California. As you can see here, its acorn morphology is slightly different. It's a robust little acorn. The pictures there aren't great. They do tend to have more lobed leaves, but nonetheless, you're only going to find Engelmann oak if you're down in the extreme parts of Southern California. And this is one of the most recognizable oak trees in California, as its name implies. The coast live oak spreads throughout the coast range from San Diego County up to about northern Sonoma County. I've found a few scattered in southern Mendocino County, but it is certainly the oak of the central coast counties. I put up some other examples there of trees that are commonly found with it, both California buckeye and the madrone. Vigorous sprouter following cutting and fire, and again, often part of a much wider and diverse plant community with the examples I put there on the screen for you. As you move farther north and you get out of the agrifolia range, you get into the interior live oak range, again, widely distributed throughout California. Get my book here. Found throughout the northern part of California's range. I'm trying to see if it's also found in the Sierras, I believe it is. Yes. And again, similar in plant growth form as as agrifolia, its leaves tend to be slightly different, and oh, here it is widely distributed throughout that bathtub ring, and again, a dominant tree in much of the Sierra ranges as well. One of my personal favorite oak trees, just from its stateliness, is California black oak, or Quercus kelloggii. Again, widely distributed over much of California. I think it's a stately tree. If you've ever seen it in the hands of a fine woodworker, some of the products that this tree can produce is nothing short of stunning. More northernly, along the Coast Range, though it's spread throughout California, you can find stands as far south as San Diego County. A high elevation tree in the Sierras, that one picture I showed you, going back into Yosemite, beautiful trees down in the Yosemite Valley. And again, a vigorous sprouter. In fact, it's difficult, at least on the North Coast, to find a stand of black oaks that aren't all multiple sprouted trees. These trees were heavily harvested for the railroad, or for charcoal, or for fuel wood in days gone by, and it is the unusual black oak to find a single stem that came from an acorn. Many of them are sprouts that have 3 or 4 large sprouts that now comprise the structure of the tree. So I think what I tried to do here today was give you a broad overview of the oak resources, and recognize, please, as you're listening to me, that there are a number of resources out there that you can go to. Some of these beautiful tabletop books that will break down different types of oak tree communities much better than I did today. I think it's important to think about it, and as I started off my talk, when we talk about sustainability of forests, it's important to remember that there's often more than one plant associated with a plant community. It's important to understand the reproductive strategies of components of the plant community. It's important to try and maintain various cohorts of age and sizes within the plant community, so that you can have generational continuance of the community over time, and not just get focused on the trees, but remember that what we're trying to do is address the functionality of oak forests or oak communities, and that's all functionality, whether it's maintaining water flows, energy flows, as well as the structural components of the trees themselves. So I think I'm just about done, and I thank you for your time, and I think now we turn it back over to Rick.
Yeah, well, thanks.